Hi, welcome back. This is part 2 of our end of semester capstone. And today we're going to talk about how popular misunderstanding and misuse of biology perpetuates racism. This is part of my pitch of why was this class important to take? Why did we have to spend so much time talking about biology? Well, we had to learn some biology to understand where it does and where it does not come into play. So first up, there is a massive content warning for racism in this lecture. In order to thoroughly dispute some of what people have historically said, it is important to properly quote them so that we can see just how shitty they are. Just see just how wrong they are. I have kept that to a minimum. I'm not just going to put racism on your screen just for the sheer sake of it. It's always going to be there with a purpose. So let's start with, of course, definitions. I love definitions. We need to have a shared vocabulary to do some of these discussions. Race is an informal taxonomical hierarchy. It has no formal definition. There is no list of criteria that you need in order to call something a race. Ethnicity is a group of people who identify with each other. They often share similar traits. People generally associated with external physical features and sort of living in the same place. A subspecies, although it sounds somewhat pejorative, is a taxonomical category that exists below species. So remember kingdom, phylum, class, or domain, kingdom, phylum, class, or family, genus, species. Well, there are subfamilies, superfamilies. There's all sorts of extra things in there because we love to make things complicated. And below species is subspecies. It is the lowest rank. For example, are tigers. Even though they're all Panthera tigris, there are different subspecies. Finally, a cline. A cline is a gradient of phenotype within a population. So people who live closer to the equator, who have historically lived closer to the equator, have darker skin. As you move further from the equator, that skin tone gets lighter because it is no longer an appropriate adaptation. That is a cline. It's just a gradient of phenotype across a population. More definitions. Prejudice. Prejudice is a preconceived opinion, usually negative, about a person, group of people, but it is preconceived, doesn't have to be based on anything. Can be based on limited experience, can be based on whatever, but it is usually negative. Discrimination is the unjust treatment of a group of people based on their membership or perceived membership within a group or of a group. Racism is using power to act upon prejudice of race, resulting in discrimination. Usually we talk about systemic discrimination. So not just on an individual scale, but across a large group of people, across entire categories of people. Finally, racialism is slightly different. It is the belief that humans can be sorted into races. So underpinning racism is this concept of racialism. If we didn't have if we didn't believe that sorting people into races was even a reasonable thing to do, in theory, racism wouldn't exist. Why am I qualified to talk about racism? Straight up, I am not. I am not qualified to talk about what it is like to experience racism. You've seen me. I am very white. I am, however, qualified to talk about how biology has been misused by people who try and support racialism. So I am not, again, I'm not here to talk about the experiences of how damaging racism can be and is. is somebody else's lane. It is decidedly not mine. But when we talk about but all of this is supported by the idea that races are even a thing we should be thinking about. And biology has been used to underpin that for centuries. And that's what I'm going to talk about. You may remember that race we talked about social constructs in terms of gender. Race is also another example of a social construct. Races have no basis in biology. They were actually invented to impose a racial hierarchy with white people on top. We can talk about what we mean when we say white people. Whiteness is not necessarily has to do with the color of people's skin. I'm going to get into this more in the part 3 of this 3-part capstone. But briefly, when we say white people, whiteness is a system of exclusion. This is very apparent in the fact that people have been previously had signs on their doors that said things like, Irish people need not apply, or discrimination against Polish people who are also very light-skinned. If the only thing that was needed to be included in the category of white people, or properly, I guess more accurately speaking, would be people with power, would be, we wouldn't need the term white trash. White trash definitionally implies that the color of someone's skin is not necessarily the only prerequisite for entry into the club of whiteness. Again, more on this in the next lecture. Biology has frequently been used as a justification not just for racialism, but for racism as well. Finally, prejudice and hate are the primary drivers of racism. Biology has always been used and misused as a primary mechanism of racialism. The other thing here is that just because I am putting forward that, or just because race is a social construct, does not mean that racism isn't real. People have been victims of racism for centuries. It is not just because people come along now and be like, actually, race isn't real, does not mean that people have not been discriminated against based on the color of their skin or other sort of superficial attributes. Let's start out with a history here of race. So I said centuries, right? I just said race has been sort of around for centuries, and that's maybe seems like a less of a long period of time than some people might think, right? It feels like race has been around forever. It's some inescapable, permanent fixture of society, not just our society, but society in general. This isn't necessarily true. While Aristotle had some nasty things to say about people from Asia, it is my understanding, and this classics is not my field, but it's my understanding that this is largely regarded as more of a general form of xenophobia and is not actually tied to races as we currently conceptualize them. The Greeks also, it should be noted that they believed that these differing physical features were due to environmental factors. The first sort of modern concept of race that we can see is that the first people to try and classify humans based on skin color occurred in the late 1500s with these two schmucks. I don't know much about them, but this is what they did. Carl Linnaeus, Swedish naturalist and physician, lived in the 1700s. He came up with a taxonomical system in the Systema Naturae. This you may have, even if you haven't heard of him, you have heard of domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Carl Linnaeus, this is where that originates. That our whole taxonomical system can be traced back to this guy. He's the one that sort of codified it. He described 5 races of humans, and the next 2 slides have some quotes from him, some things that he wrote which are very racist. But we'll start out with Europeans. I don't know, we're white. Sanguine, acute, inventive, governed by laws. Ooh, laws. Covered with close vestments. We're clothes, tight-fitting clothes. And we're covered by laws. The Americas, this would be the indigenous people to the Americas, where we live. You know what? I'm not actually going to say this. You can read this for yourself. Regulated by customs. Okay. That's a loaded sentence. Next up, we have Asian people and Asiaticus and Africanus. He has a lot of real bad things to say about people with black skin. We'll say Asiaticus ruled by opinions, and Africanus is governed by caprice, which is like everything on this slide is bad. Also worth noting that it said before that he described 5 races of humans. Oh, we've only listed 4 here. No, this is a different person. What's up with the 5th race? Well, the 5th race, you might be asking, is they were mythical people. Things like satyrs, I don't know, centaurs and shit. This is included in his scientific publication of the types of people, like mythical creatures. So maybe this isn't the most just the best source, let's say. But remember, this is the very founding of our taxonomical system. Next up is Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant is if you watch The Good Place, you've heard of him, but he's Chidi's favorite moral philosopher. He wrote, he described 4 different races in his 1777 essay, white, black, red, and yellow. This man was racist as shit. He believed that blackness was, and again, I'm very sorry for this, he believed that blackness was some sort of disease that could be cured. He is the first person he's in here because he's the first person that tried to tie it to some sort of medical condition. He believed there was just too much iron in the blood, I believe. And that black babies were born white, except for a little bit around the genitals, and the blackness spread from there. I don't need to tell you that this is bullshit, but he wrote this. Also, he never left his hometown. He is sort of one of the originators of these, one of the primary originators of these white, black, red, and yellow. He's still taught in philosophy courses. It's mind-boggling. You still teach people, but without context. This is bad. We're moving on to the next one. Next one's not better. Samuel Morton. He's a skull dude. You ever seen people with calipers trying to measure skulls? That relates back to this guy. I forget the name of his book, it's not important, but his main premise, his main hypothesis was that larger skulls meant larger brains, and larger brains meant smarter people. But that's not actually what he set out to prove. He more set out to prove that people like him were smarter, and that they had and then used the skull size to try and prove that. He is known as the father of scientific racism, and he used skulls from so here's the thing, skull size does not, or brain size does not mean smartness, right? Very large animals have some very large skulls. Right? Whales, enormous skulls. As far as I know, whales aren't doing calculus. It is actually the ratio, and as far as humans go, if you account for the ratio of body size to skull size, we're all pretty much the same. We all fall within very, very similar parameters. But I want to talk about, I sort of got to this point of making this talk, and I had a realization. I was about to go through and talk about how he actually used skulls from women and children in his non-white groups, and used, the skulls of men for his European or whatever category he called them. And then there's sort of history that follows on from that, where people discovered people realized that Australian Aboriginal indigenous people existed, and that like their skulls were larger, and like so that threw a wrench, and then turns out it's actually just the front part of the skull that's the important part. That's where all the higher thinking is, and it's just super convenient that this didn't that's the part that white people's skulls are larger. And then that ended up, right, this subdivision ended up causing schisms within European scientists because some European people had smaller, anyway, it was a whole thing. And like his whole mechanism of measuring the size of skulls was how many mustard seeds he could get inside them, he could sort of fill them up with. And that seems like a really poor sort of metric. So you could teach an entire course on the history of racism in science. The thing that I want you to take away from this is that A, skull size is bullshit. Immanuel Kant is just like a historically enormous racist. And that racism is baked into the very core of biology. And that if people were establishing these sorts of hierarchical structures with the intent of placing themselves on top, right? It's really weird and convenient that every time a new discovery came along, it just happened to put European white people on top, right? And also within that, European and white is not synonymous. I don't know if you've ever met anyone from Italy or the south of Italy or Greece, but they do not have sort of a skin tone that looks like mine, someone who was born in Northern Europe. This is all part of a larger pattern, and by spending time trying to like meticulously go through and debunk each of these individual ideas, I was actually giving them all too much credence. And we can actually look at this from instead of looking at individuals and how they, use the wrong size skull, used skulls from women and children who have tend to have smaller. Children absolutely always have smaller skulls. Almost always have smaller skulls than adult men. Instead of looking at this from an individualistic point of view, we can look at it from a systemic point of view. So that we can see that each of these people happen to have their own group on top. We're gonna and that this we can look at this this pattern of inventing or using science to support racist and racialist beliefs. I'm going to put 3 examples of this on here. The first one here is pretty bad, but three quick examples. First up is drapetomania. Drapetomania is the mental illness that was invented to explain the tendency of some enslaved people who repeatedly just tried to escape slavery in America. This obviously, right? I'm not going to do the bit, right? This was something that was used to explain people not wanting to be owned by somebody else. We have a medical condition, right? Someone invented it. Doesn't make it right. It just means that it wasn't even widely accepted, but it was something that it was a medical justification for holding people in increased bondage. Hysteria. We can go back to gender for a moment. Hysteria, if you've heard the term hysterectomy, it's got the same root. Hysteria is the first mental disorder exclusively attributed to women. It was characterized by anxiety, nervousness, insomnia, but also irritability and not wanting to have sex as much. If you heard the word hysterical, if someone is being hysterical, that has the origin of that has gendered very gendered origins to it, and we still see that today. The number of people who've been described as hysterical are predominantly women. The American Psychiatric Association, the largest association of psychiatrists in America, did not discontinue the term, did not get rid of the term until 1952. What the shit? Right? This is not something that happened a long time ago with people who didn't know better, right? But this practice, of treating women as being irrational or overly emotional, needing to control them because they are too emotional, that can be traced back a long time, right? We still see this today. How many times have you heard a woman or all women characterized as crazy, right? It's linked back to here. This is accepted in general society, right? We accept this in sort of polite society because it was an accepted medical practice for so long. It had a medical basis. It was told it did not have a medical basis, right? That's the thing. But it was seen as having the support of science. There's one other thing that it was characterized by as well, and that is a tendency to cause trouble. The fuck? Finally, we're going to get I want to talk about something called cultural evolutionism, or the idea that cultures the misapplication of of Darwinism to societies. People from powerful, quote unquote, Western nations often try and frame society as progressing along some single pathway from primitive to civilized. Right? If you read a lot of sort of philosophy from the 1800s, mid 1800s, you see a lot of talk about the primitive people, or barbarism. Barbarian, of note, being one of the oldest racial slurs that we know about. This has also been used to justify the removal of indigenous people from their homes, either by migration or genocide. Right, the idea that it wasn't bad because they weren't making good use of the land or something shitty like that, right? Like the idea that they were just updating the previous inhabitants. New World colonists, as well as those in Australia, and also were dismissed complex agricultural practices, right? You may have been taught that indigenous people in the Americas and Australia sort of had a very sort of hunter-gatherer society. That's like, while that is true of some people, it is a big continent. Both of them are big continents. There are a lot of different people, and people had complex agricultural practices. But because it didn't look like what Europeans considered farming, it was not recorded as such, right? Since people indigenous people have always known that's what it was. Those of us who are not, or Western researchers or scientists, have quote-unquote rediscovered the practice. This is not something that happened, again, this is not something that happened a long time ago in the deep annals of history. This next bit is a little rough. A man named Ota Benga was taken from what was at the time called the Congo Free State, and was exhibited in the Bronx Zoo alongside monkeys in 1906, right? Barely over 100 years ago, as an example of a more primitive stage of human evolution. The idea that humans have to, right, that you have to be able to domesticate animals before you can move further, before you can get to writing, before you can get to, right, before you can invent the wheel or some nonsense, right? This practice, I learned while making this slide that the practice was so widespread that there is a whole Wikipedia page for human zoos, and that it's bad. We can still see echoes of this today. You may have played or heard of the game Civilization. The whole sort of premise, right? The whole sort of technological premise of the game is based on the idea that everybody proceeds along a single pathway. We also see this in many other sort of non-entertainment ways. How many times have you ever sort of heard people come back to, go for a walk in the woods and come back and be like, civilization, right? We were in the woods and now we're somewhere better, somewhere that the land has been modified. Whereas, which dismissing sort of complex relationships that other people in the world have had and still have with the land. This is oppression justified by science. We got one more slide on this. As we saw with Carl Linnaeus, humans who were not white, people who were other, were considered less than human. This is how justification of colonialism, genocide, residential schools of Canada, how the ability to exhibit other live human beings in a zoo was justified. Right? These imagined culture people, because culture, right? The problem is that European scientists only knew Europe, at least initially, right? And they said this is how society must be because this is the only thing they knew. So when they went to other places in the world, and it did not look like, or their society did not look like what they considered to be society, these shortcomings were, or these perceived shortcomings, right? These differences were used to justify their murder and or removal. And as happens with this, right, these cultural shortcomings soon became conflated with their appearance. We see this, we still see this today. Go to any sort of newspaper, go on to social media and look up some political cartoons. Count how many people are being portrayed as being unintelligent, and how many of those people who are being portrayed as unintelligent are also drawn as overweight. Or, sorry, I don't like the word overweight, because it implies that there is a weight that somebody should be. How many of them are drawn as larger people? They had a different, right, so these appearances, right, they had different skin tone, facial features, language, culture. These became markers of their permanent otherness, an otherness that could not be escaped, some sort of innate quality. Mendel's laws, right? You remember we learned Mendel's laws. They tell us that traits are inherited independently. That was one of his primary discoveries, primary findings. So this unilinear theory of cultural evolution, the idea that cultures proceed from savage, which is a slur, to barbarian, also, like I said, a very old racial slur, to civilized, was a highly respected theory for a long time. Now, the Francis Galton, who is Darwin's cousin, famously sort of misapplied his theory to decide that, or to say that, postulate that if a species can improve over time through breeding, perhaps society can improve through breeding too. This man invented eugenics, is what he did. It is a misapplication, a gross misapplication of that theory to come to that sort of conclusion. Race is itself a very imprecise category. That's why it's part of why I imagine it makes some people uncomfortable, is they don't know how to describe someone else. It's because it's a very imprecise category, right? But not everyone who has dark skin is African American, but that's sort of the term that people have used. So, I mean, at the core of this, instead of going through every single instance of how science has sort of been shitty, we can sum a lot of this up with, if race were a precise genetic category, it would just make sense, right? We would be able to anonymize some data, look at some traits and say, this is that person, or look at some DNA and say, this person, right? This person goes in that group, this other person goes in some other group. It just doesn't work that way. The best analogy I've ever heard is that if there was some alien, right, that came down and had our exact understanding of genetics, but none of our understanding of like everything about society, and they just took the genetics of everyone, they would not come up with the, 7, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or whatever, however many races that we have. If you do it based on pure genetic classifications, there are either over 300 sort of subgroups of humans, or there are or there's one subgroup. The earliest scientific work on heredity, right, the carefully recorded research on heredity is attributed to Gregor Mendel. His work was published in 1865, but actually wasn't widely recognized until the early 1900s because he published in this obscure journal. It wasn't in English. Race predates even this earliest work in genetics, right? Everyone we just talked about, Carl Linnaeus, and Immanuel Kant, and these thinkers that came before them. This is all 1700s times, right? This is all the sort of 18th century. Race predates the earliest work in genetics, and what we've seen is a lot of people using this genetic information to try and shoehorn the biology to make it fit the social categories that we already were using. Again, a great example of this is skin tone. Here we have the global distribution of skin tones. We can see that skin tone, right? People who are of many different skin tones tend to live in places close to the equator. This does not mean that every one of these people is black. It doesn't make, the Caribbean people, there are indigenous Australians, there are people in India. This is all just the same way that malaria is not something that is synonymous with black people, right? It is synonymous with the location in which malaria exists, or it's synonymous with, sickle cell anemia is not a sort of black specific genetic condition, but it is synonymous with places that have malaria, which happen to be near the equator. But that doesn't stop people from trying to take genetic samples and look at them. And there's a great quote from an academic named Kim Tallbear, who said, this may not be a precise quote, that said that the methods of these genetic researchers, right? If you asked any of the researchers who have done sort of genetic work and be like, oh no, this is all just, we are not racist. We are trying to, we're not trying to determine how people are different. We're trying to look at how people are the same. We just want to look at the history of look at the genetic differences. And you don't achieve that goal, right? The goal is antithetical to their methods. That you don't achieve a sort of post-racial society by looking at spending a lot of time researching how people are different. It's not to say genetics is not an important field of study. It's just the manner in which it is done. So, but yeah, let's bring genetics in here. What about genetics, right? The first thing I want to do is sort of dispel this myth of a genetically pure population. Right, if we had the ability to, if humans were in these different biological categories, we would see this be borne out in genetic data. Well, we actually have a tool, we have a measure of determining whether or not a subspecies exists. Right, so if a large this is called the Population Fixation Index, the FST. So if a large group is genetically homogeneous, it will have a low FST. If it has a lot of individuals who have been isolated from each other for a long period of time, to the point that they have sort of started to undergo the early stages of speciation, or they've started to be subjected to selective pressures and genetic drift, there will be a high FST, right? So the higher the FST, the more genetically different the population is. The cutoff for a subspecies, again, that's the taxonomical level below species, is 0.25, 25% difference. Homo sapiens, humans, we have an FST of 0.11, not even halfway to the cutoff for subspecies. So there are no subspecies within the species of Homo sapiens. This hasn't stopped a lot of people from using genetic data, however, right? And this is where I come in, right? We say, oh, here's some different continents, people in different places must be very different, and we can determine the precise types, or the precise sort of genetic origin of these differences, right? These innate differences, alleged, they're not innate differences, right? These alleged differences by looking at the genetics of different people. You may often see graphs like this, right, where we have, right, who knows what the axes are here, but there's some, right, this is some graph, and they have looking at different people and say, look, we have these discrete groups, right? So this is a paper by Lee et al. Studied 938 unrelated individuals from 51 populations. Okay. Well, 938, if we're trying to classify all of humanity, which is, I don't know, a couple billion. Let me pause and look up how many people there are. 7.8 billion people, says Google. So we're sort of attempting to classify a large number of people, an incredibly large number of people, less than 1,000. I mean, there's limitations based on how much funding people can get, et cetera, et cetera. But here we have this sort of graph where we can see, okay, yeah, there are these people who are different. And, we might see, or this is a different graph. This is, so both of these, right, who knows what these axes are? I know what these axes are, I'm about to tell you. This is published in Science. This is one of the most prestigious, one of the two most prestigious journals in the world. This is the axes here are something called PCAs, or principal component analyses. What they've done is basically graphed a whole bunch of data across multiple axes, and then taken a trend line through that, and then taken that trend line and said, okay, well, how close is everything? Right? Take this as the sum of multiple different factors. So here we have some set of factors, and here we have some other set of multiple factors, and they're graphing where they exist on that plane against each other. It's a little complicated, but there's a couple things going on here. One, this is sort of biased by the fact that if you were to just not have these, if you were to not have any of this right here, and if we got rid of all this, and you were to just look at some of these, you might actually not draw all these groups, right? Because these groups are sort of where they pulled from. But if we're looking at sort of racial categories, you could have a group like this, right? You could have a grouping like this and say, okay, this is one group, here is another group, here's another group. But you could also say, well, what if we subdivide it more? And it's sort of limited. One of the potential biasing factors in analyses such as this is how many groups do you want to see? Right? If you want to make a graph, right? You can do numbers showing that you've made good groups for just about any number of people, right? We could have 1, 2, 3 groups of people. We could have 2 groups of people, right? Just 1 and 2. One of the potential biasing factors to analyses such as this is just how many racial groups do you want there to be? Okay, cool. Let's draw that many circles. The other problem here is that these are not representations of how these are not accurate representations of genetic diversity, right? That these don't prove that there are different races of people. Genetics, these types of genetic analyses do not prove that races are different. Now at this point, someone's going to burst in through my window and say, wait a minute, a local biology professor doesn't think skin color is genetic. And I'm like, sit down, right? I'm not done. There's more to this going on than this. Of course, skin color is genetic, right? Of course, we're genetically different from people who are far away. This is not a surprise, right? The fact that we have genetic differences from people who are far away from each other, far away from us, is not even a little bit surprising. When people had less sort of freedom of migration due to, no airplanes or trains, right? And of course, you're genetically similar to people who lived where your ancestors lived, right? And phenotypes are largely dictated by genotypes, right? Skin color is, of course, determined by genetics. but those differences don't constitute a meaningful genetic categories. So let's look at the problems with some of these. First up, there's sampling error, right? As always, we can always look at our assumptions behind analyses such as these, right? So our assumptions here is that people from oh, this is a typo. People from the same region are genetically homogeneous, right? Or that they are representative of the people around them, right? Of large groups of people. 938 people to model 7 billion is, we're assuming that these are representative people. And that these genetic differences are somehow meaningful. And that the research is pulled from every location within each region. I don't know exactly where within Africa these people, the research is pulled from, but we can give them, well, I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt on this specific case, because it doesn't actually matter, because we can poke enough holes in the rest of this, right? These groups can be, we're going to look at sampling error here, but these groups, if we look at where we pull data from here, right, if we just say that, okay, well, there are 3 populations, African, European, and Native American. Those are the 3 types of ancestral populations. Sorry, Australia. And, I don't know, other places, right, Asia, I suppose. That these, if we were to pull from, those are 3 different places, right, this isn't precisely what's happening here, but if we were to pull information, if we were to pull data, genetic data, do DNA sequencing on people from Africa, Europe, and indigenous Americans, of course we see very different instances, very different DNA there, right? If we pulled from those 3 places, sure, there's this huge swath, and we can draw some lines around this, say, look, genetically different people, right? People with European ancestry, obviously different from Native Americans, and different from people from Africa, from African heritage. But the problem here is that there exist many people between a lot of these places, right? Let's look at a map. Let's bring this map up, right? Yes, someone from here, right? Let's say we have the Lakota people up here, right? And people have done some genetic testing, right? And they are going to be different from, they may be different from the inhabitants of sort of south all the way down South America, but they may not be wildly different from Pueblo people, from the American Southwest, from the people in Mexico, Central America, down all the way down here. Yes, but so if you remember that term Klein, people, there will be because there are changing conditions, and this is a gradient, right? People don't exist only in Alaska and only in Mexico and only in the southern tip of South America, right? People exist all along this continuum. This will give us a Klein, right? This will give us a gradient of phenotypes. But by pulling only from, or by sort of classifying this group as one group, and sort of this group as another group, of course we'll see differences, right? This is the problem of sampling error. So the more granular our data is, the more, or the less granular data is, the more people can misinterpret this data to come to the conclusion that races are a thing, that they are some sort of that they exist in biology. And there's also the consideration that, do these differences that are being mapped here correlate with the differences we associate with races, right? I don't think we mentioned it yet, but the factors that we use to sort of define races are very superficial. It is skin tone, eye shape, and hair texture. Turns out these, the information that's being assayed here, right, all of this is all non-coding DNA. This is all intron sequences. None of this is coding DNA, and it's important that they chose non-coding regions of DNA for this type of analysis because these are not, non-coding DNA is not subject to the selective pressure that something like skin color is, right? Because skin color is absolutely subject to selective pressure based on, or to environmental factors. So if you want to look at sort of rates of mutation, you want to look at, if you want to look at sort of the background change, what is the sort of, if we assume there's, let's make up a number, like one mutation every like 10 years, right? So if you have 100 mutations, you can say, there's 1,000 years separating these two populations. It's important for the way they want to do the analysis that they chose non-coding populations. But that is a problem. And we also don't, right, and we see people using this data to come to these sorts of conclusions, right? They're sort of either ignoring or cutting out the middle here, or just sort of looking at these points and saying, look, we have these other populations. But we don't see people doing that same sort of thing when we do assays of, across the British Isles, let's say, right? Across Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Turns out, yes, you are genetically similar to people who live near you, usually, right? That's it. Or 200 years ago, people were very genetically similar to the people near them because they didn't move so much. Right? But no one's talking about the race of Northern Islanders or the race of the Isle of Man, right? This is not some separate, people aren't using this to say it's a separate genetic category. But they are when it comes to this data. So we return again to the idea of biological essentialism. Just to recap, biological essentialism is the idea that biology precedes culture, or that culture has some sort of biological basis, right? That women are bad at driving because of DNA, which is nonsense. The problems with some of these analyses, right, is that again, these principal component analyses of genetic differences are actually looking at non-coding regions of the DNA. They're looking at introns, not exons, not the parts of genes that are expressed to become proteins, the things that actually cause phenotypes. So these differences don't represent any difference in genotype or phenotype. None of these analyses have any relation to skin color, eye shape, hair texture, hair color, eye color, any of these things. Right, so yeah, that includes the small and superficial group of phenotypes that we use to classify races. But again, we see science used to justify racialism, the belief that there are races, that races are some sort of important category of humans, or a subcategory of humans. But then this science is used by people with racist ideologies to claim that they are innately superior, or to support their pre-existing belief that they are innately superior. Race is a social construct, right? It doesn't make sense because race is a social construct. These modern forms of racialism, this genetic racialism, right, does not need to be to explicitly place white people at the top, right? To place Europeans at the top, or to place anyone at the top, because that belief already exists. I'm not saying that the authors of these studies have racist or racialist agendas. I would be surprised if they had explicit racialist agendas. I do not think that they do, to be very clear. But regardless of what they believe, their work is being used to support these ideas, right? People can point to the PCA graph and say, look, these people are genetically different. And then they leave out the graph that the graphs represent analyses of intronic, that they're actually not coding. So that is in part sort of my argument for why a comprehensive biology education is important. as well as for a greater degree of responsibility that we should have as research biologists. That's going to be it. We're at like 50 minutes, so that's going to be it for this. There's going to be a part 2 of this part 2 lecture, so we'll call it, I don't know, part B. There's going to be a part B to this lecture where we're going to look at how these myths, how this misapplication of biology manifests in our society today. So I will see you then.